Well, hello and welcome. I'm glad that you're with us as we continue our chronological read through of Scripture. We just finished reading God's instructions regarding the holiness of the priest. If you recall, there were some additional regulations that applied only to the priest with respect to their holiness. Today, we're going to begin reading about who can eat those parts of the offering that are designated as food for the priest. The note in the Lutheran Study Bible explains that God is establishing parameters for those who can eat his sacred meal. The priest, obviously, that's who it's intended for. Their immediate family, their slaves, their children, as well as any widowed or divorced daughters that the priest may have who don't have some sons to support them. However, no one who is unclean at the time may eat of the meat, whether they're in the group of people that are allowed to or not. If they're unclean, they're not allowed to participate. And let's see, no, there's no lay people that can participate in it. Their indentured servants cannot, their employees cannot, nor can their daughters who are married to a layman. Again, what all of this does is it reminds us that the meat is holy and it's not to be desecrated by anything that is unclean or not set apart as holy. The Lord's Supper is also a holy meal. It's reserved for those who are made priests with Jesus by baptism. But just as it was important to discern between the clean and the unclean when the priests of Israel served their meals, so it's important for the pastors in the church to discern that those who partake in the Lord's Supper have not desecrated themselves, in other words, made themselves unclean, with impenitence or heresy, lest they partake to their harm rather than to their benefit. Chapter 22 then continues describing what qualifies an animal for use as a sacrifice, really what disqualifies an animal from use as a sacrifice. And you'll find this basically the exact same criteria that disqualified a priest from being able to present the sacrifice. I guess if you were to look at it kind of succinctly, the sacrifice must be without blemish or defects. See, sacrifices are to offer the best to God. It's not a way of culling one's herd or something like that. Notice also the restrictions on sacrificing a young animal before it is at least 7 days old. You might remember that a male child is circumcised on the seventh day. That 7-day time frame seems to basically sets up a scenario where the young is separated from its mother and has a life on its own. That's the length of time that it takes for it to be regarded that way. God also forbade the sacrificing of a newborn animal on the same day as its mother. That may seem a little bit odd to us, but basically that reflects a pagan practice that was supposed to increase the fertility of the herd. So just to be sure that there was no, shall we say, crossover on that, God forbade them from doing something like that. Jesus is the unblemished sacrifice and the unblemished priest who offers it. Jesus is both. We're purified by his sacrifice, and we're able to eat his life-giving bread, his own flesh in communion. Since we are purified by his blood, our bodies and souls, our offerings and good works, our prayers and praises, our acts of thanksgiving and confession of faith, all of those are acceptable to God, who actually delights in them and enjoys them. From there, we move on to chapter 23. Chapter 23 describes, I guess you could call it a calendar of holy times, times that are to be observed as holy to God when no work is to be done. You're familiar with a number of those, some maybe not so much. There's the weekly Sabbath, you're familiar with that. The Passover, you're familiar with that. The Festival of First Fruits, you may be familiar with that. It's a celebration of the barley harvest. There's a Feast of Weeks, which we know as Pentecost. And then there's the Feast of Trumpets, which is basically simply a day of rest that's announced by trumpets. There's the Day of Atonement. We spoke about that at length a day or two ago. And then finally, the Feast of Booths, which reminds them of their time in the wilderness. They actually set up booths and live in the booth like you would set up a tent in your backyard and basically live in your backyard for a week to remind them of the time that they had spent in the wilderness. Well, again, as always, I continue to pray that these readings that you're doing give you more insight into what's going on, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, and that you grow and that you're edified by these. I look forward to gathering with you again tomorrow as we continue our readings. May God be with you and bless you.